Okay.
All right. Well, we'll go ahead and get started. For those who don't know, my name's Todd Ashby. I'm the director at the MPO. The team has been hard at work on getting the Economic Development District going. We've created the SEDS, which Gunnar will talk a little bit about here in a little bit. And then as we were going through that and talking with EDA, funding opportunity came up that we thought was too good to pass up, even though we're not quite an EDD yet. EDA is aware that we're in this process and recommended we share these opportunities with everyone and work with you to, if you're interested in a particular grant program. And Andrew will talk about that in a little bit. So with that, again, thank you for joining us today, and I'll turn it over to Gunnar.
Thanks, Todd. Thank you, everyone, for taking the time to be here today. We have a presentation put together for you. We hope that we can get through that in relatively short order and get quickly to the question and answer as the last section. But before we do, I'm going to give you a very brief background on what we've been up to, and then pass it off to Andrew, who's going to spend most of the time speaking about the funding programs. So without further ado, as Todd mentioned, we've been in the process of creating an economic development district. The Mid-Iowa region, consisting of the counties of Boone, Dallas, Story, Jasper, Polk, Marion, and Warren, has not had an economic development district, and it is now for the first time eligible since 2008 to become one due to the economic distress caused by the pandemic and the emergency declaration. So we've been at work for the last 18 months or so trying to get the EDD designation off the ground. I'm going to glaze over a lot of the stuff here, but I do want to invite anyone on the call who's not familiar with the process so far. If you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to us. We'd be happy to get you up to speed on that. To facilitate the EDD, we have to create a district organization. So we're in the process of creating a nonprofit called MIPA, or Mid-Iowa Planning Alliance for Community Development. The three main benefits that we're going to have with this organization is we'll have the regional plan, that's the SEDS that Todd referenced. There's funding availability that we can help connect jurisdictions to, like we're talking about today, and then staff support, which is the role we're playing today. So I do want to give a plug for the draft SEDS document that was published earlier this week for public comment. You can find that at midiowaplanningalliance.com/SEDS. We'd ask you to review that online, leave any comments that you would want. We're also hosting a public meeting 1:30 on August 24th. You'd be welcome to attend that. Final note before I pass this over to Andrew is that we are recording today's session and we will be sending out these slides after the fact. So just want to let you guys know that we will be following up with that. If you are not receiving our EDD updates, please put your email address in the chat box if you would like to start receiving those. And that's the email list that we will be using to distribute the slide deck as well as a link to the video. Okay, with that, I will pass it off to Andrew.
Awesome. Thanks, Gunnar. So the next slide. What we are looking to do today is to go over these 6 programs that were released from EDA as part of the American Rescue Plan Act. At the end of that, we will go over just kind of what the process is to apply for these sorts of grants, and just exactly how that will look. So without further ado, there were 6 programs that were announced late last month. Those are the Build Back Better Challenge, the Good Jobs Challenge, Economic Adjustment Assistance, Indigenous Communities, Travel, Tourism, and Outdoor Recreation, and the Statewide Planning, Research, and Networks. There's also one carve-out category, which I'll mention now, and if anyone wants more information about that, I'd be happy to supply that, but that's the Coal Community Challenge. That's not a separate program necessarily. It's more of a carve out from a couple of the existing programs or the programs that they're implementing right now. It's specifically geared towards coal communities. And they define that as communities impacted by the coal industry or related industries within the last 15 years. That's the reason why we're not talking about it later today, but we did want to mention it because one of the eligible activity types to look at are coal-fired plants. So we know there aren't a ton of those around the region necessarily, but there still are a few. So if you want more information about that, about how you can get funding for your coal-fired plant, just please drop us a line. We'll be happy to do that. Next slide. So EDA has grouped those 6 programs into 3 different categories. Those are jobs for today, communities built for all, and regions for the future. We will be covering 4 out of the 6 categories. The 2 that we really won't discuss today are Indigenous communities, because we don't have any eligible communities in our region for that, and the statewide planning, research, and networks fund. That fund is specifically geared towards funding research about EDA's programming, such as looking at the effectiveness of their programming, the effectiveness of the implementation, that sort of thing. So if you're interested in that sort of application for funding, please let us know. Otherwise, we're going to focus in on the 4 categories we feel are most applicable, which are the Good Jobs Challenge, Travel, Tourism, and Outdoor Recreation, Economic Adjustment Assistance, and Build Back Better Regional Challenge. Next slide. Just to give you an idea of the scope of funding we're talking about, you can see the total funding available amounts on the screen before you, broken down by funding category. I will note that this doesn't quite add up to $3 billion, but that is the number that EDA has said. And also note that even though this looks like a lot of money being given out, some of it isn't as available to communities as first indicated. So we'll break that down by each of those funding categories to show you exactly what we're talking about. Next slide. First up is this Build Back Better Regional Challenge. So there are out of the 4 programs we're going to cover, 2 are nationally competitive and 2 are regionally competitive. So the Build Back Better Challenge is a nationally competitive grant program. This is geared towards funding large transformative projects in a region. So EDA has broken this program out into 2 different phases. Phase 1, which will consist of 50 to 60 awards of $500,000, so 1 award per region, to accelerate readiness of a future application, which will happen in phase 2, as well as furthering the goals or furthering the ideas that are generated out of this project if a phase 2 award isn't made. Phase 2, which is dependent on receiving a phase 1 award, will consist of 20 to 30 awards from 2 applicants for 3 to 8 transformative projects with funding between $25 and $100 million. So we recognize that individual communities will probably not be applying for this. This is very much a partnership between organizations type funding activity type. So it will be a consortium of people applying for this. But we did want to make note of this before, just as part of this funding application, in case anyone has any ideas on what this will look like. But the Build Back Better Challenge is focusing on regional industry clusters or clusters. And there is $1 billion available for that. Phase 1 will be 100% federally funded, that 500,000. Phase 2 has that traditional 80% to 20% federal fund rate. The more local match put into it, just with any funding program, the more competitive it will be. And the deadline for phase 1 is October 19th. Again, that is just to formulate ideas, figure out partnerships, and then the actual application for those large projects that are generated will be in phase 2, which is due March 15th. And again, that phase 2 is predicated, and you have to receive a phase 1 award to go after phase 2. Next slide. And to give you an idea what we talk about when we're talking about a regional growth cluster, they're looking at 4 main things when we're talking about clusters. So 1, for a strong application, we have to have or grow regional assets, as well as having industry leadership. So strong growth cluster will have industry leaders and as part of the consortium from both the private sector and the public nonprofit side as well. Anything that results out of this has to be sustainable. It has to be able to be maintained into the future. as well as also being equitable. Equity is actually kind of a key theme seen throughout EDA's NOFOs. So that will kind of pop up in all of these applications. Next slide. So this, I won't read this to you, and I'd just like to note too, the slides will be provided after this meeting as well, so you can feel free to take a look at this. This is pulled straight out of the NOFO. This is just to give you an idea when we talk about industry cluster or clusters, just the wide breadth and scope of type of projects that could be included in this. EDA doesn't specifically say what kind of projects they will fund or what will be fundable, but they do want to give you an idea of what projects could be included. So next slide. So the next funding program we're going to talk about is a Good Jobs Challenge. This is the second fund that is funded nationally. So this program is designed to provide funding for regional workforce systems. So EDA would ideally make awards to a system lead entity of a regional workforce system or a backbone organization of a sectoral partnership that will apply for the funding. So this funding is also encourages projects that are looking to reach out and affect historically underserved populations. So we're talking about communities of color, women, and other groups facing labor market barriers. Again, this is directly out of the notice of funding. So just to give you an idea of what we're targeting, or what they're targeting with this, there's $500 million available. Again, this is a national competition. This program has up to 100% federal aid cost share as being available, but they do highly recommend demonstration of non-EDA committed resources and funding to this. And again, the deadline to apply for this is January 26th. Next slide. So in this Good Jobs Challenge, and again, probably not necessarily community focused necessarily, more of a regional type application given the breadth and scope of the things they're talking about funding. But it doesn't really matter where you're at in what they define as the three steps or three part of the process. You could be in a system development where you're asking for funding to help establish and develop a regional workforce training system. You could be in the design phase, which is identifying needed industries and workers and developing the skill training criteria and materials. Or you could actually be in the program implementation phase, which is funding to deliver workforce training and wraparound services. So so you can really be in any step in this to apply, but all the ducks have to be in a row by that January timeframe. In addition to this, when we're talking about not just regional training, what could be part of this too is workforce training through individual employers as well. Either that would fit in this program or another program I'm about ready to talk about. But just to give you an idea of what we're talking about, it's job training and workforce development are the key themes on this challenge. Next slide. So the next fund we're talking about is the Economic Adjustment Assistance Fund. This is going to be very familiar to those of you who have worked with EDA before. This is by far their most flexible funding program and can fund a lot of different things. So technical assistance, planning, workforce development, entrepreneurship, public works, all of that falls under this category. So fundable projects are going to be like those traditional economic adjustment fund projects that, if you're familiar with that, are fundable through their traditional EDA funding. The difference with this program versus the other two programs is that rather than being a national application program, it's what we call a regional application. So that 500 million that we listed for this program isn't really available to all. So the first one is that 200 million of that is actually set aside for coal communities. So only 300 million of which is available across the country. In addition to that, they have decided to break that up into regional allocations. So the Denver region, of which Iowa is a part of, is getting 59 million. 24 of that is set aside for coal communities. So in reality, of that 500 million, only 35 million is available to communities and eligible entities in central Iowa. And because it is regionally focused, the local EDA office gets to decide when funding applications are taken. So even though it may list in the NOFO, they'll take it until next year, it actually is really regionally dependent on when those applications are. And through communications with local EDA staff at the Denver office, they've decided to kind of look at this into 2 tranches. So they'll be taking and looking at applications in that tranche 1, which will be due at the end of September. And most likely a lot of communities won't, or organizations won't have everything ready to go by then. So they'll have a second tranche, which will be at the end of December, and they'll start looking at projects they've received then. And then after that, I believe they've indicated that they will, if they have any money left over, they will provide funding on an ongoing basis, essentially until funds run out. And they look at, when they're funding awards, typically $1 to $2 million per award. Next slide. So on here are a list of the fundable activity types. Again, for those of you who are familiar with this program, this will look familiar. For those of you who are not, a lot of it is infrastructure related. So water sewer system improvements that are needed for private investment. Same thing with industrial parks, incubators, accelerators, brownfield development, workforce training facilities, telecommunications infrastructure. All of that is eligible under this economic adjustment assistance. And if you're a community that is looking to apply for funding to fund public works type activities that will directly benefit a company or create or retain jobs, this is the funding program you would want to apply for. So in that case, if your community, you have a company that's willing to put in 50 to 100 jobs, but they need some type of public investment to do so, this would be the application fund that you would apply through. Next slide. And last but not least, what we'll touch on here today is the Travel, Tourism, and Outdoor Recreation Fund. This is a new fund. I don't think that they've really offered anything like this in the past EDA, but this is really geared towards helping communities that have been hit hardest by the COVID-19, and specifically to that travel, tourism, and outdoor recreation category. So EDA will fund those kind of projects, both non-construction and construction projects that are focused in on a few key areas, but again, really focusing on areas that are most hard hit or damaged through the COVID-19 pandemic. This is also a regional award. So you have, even though it lists 750 million as total available, in actuality, about 510 million of that is actually set aside for states. So Iowa will be receiving, the state of Iowa will be receiving some type of allocation through this program directly. Well, they have to apply first, but they have money set aside for them that will become available later. But for communities to apply, this also has a regional allocation share. So for jurisdictions, entities in central Iowa that would like to apply for something like this, you're looking at $19 million being available in the Denver region, which is about a 10 state area. Again, this is typically 80% federal cost share, can go up to 100% depending on impacts of COVID-19. But again, the larger the local match, the more competitive projects will be. Same deadlines as the economic adjustment assistance, since it is a regionally based award. They have decided the tranche 1, tranche 2 type activities. And again, you're looking at that $1 to $2 million award range. Next slide. And just to give you an idea of what we're talking about with these sorts of projects, there's really a lot of it's geared towards the outdoor recreational space. So you're talking water, wastewater improvements related to some type of travel, tourism, or outdoor activity. You have cultural arts and tourism facilities, workforce training, countrywide and multi-state travel, tourism, and outdoor recreation program. And just as an aside, they did highlight the fact that if you're looking at doing a local or regional recreation promotion program, that is not eligible for this, but could be eligible under the state funding allocation. And the other thing to note is they did highlight the fact that even though if there is a project that might be eligible to apply, there is no job creation retention requirement like there is with these other funds. But if you do apply, just note that it won't necessarily be really that competitive because of the limited funding availability on a project by project basis. Next slide.
Your Jimmy Jones is here.
So
Did
we
it
wanted
load?
to talk about
Sorry.
process. Next slide. What we're going to do is I'm going to go over kind of some key themes throughout all of these funding programs and then talk about next steps. So to note, each project that you potentially could apply for has to have an eligible entity, which we'll touch on the next slide, in order to apply for that funding. And if you are an eligible entity to apply, you will need two things. One is a grants.gov and sam.gov account. For most communities in our region, that won't be a problem, but it is worth noting since it does take some time to set up those accounts. A project cannot apply for more than one funding program, but if you are an applicant with multiple funding multiple projects, you can apply for multiple funding programs. Just have to have one per program. And this has come up a couple of times, but EDA mentioned if you're receiving other ARPA funding through another program or direct allocation, that doesn't impact or have anything to do with these funds. So please note that will not impact your ability to apply for these programs. All projects, just like all EDA activities, have to align with the current region's current SEDS, draft SEDS in our case, or equivalent EDA accepted regional plan. And all projects must be consistent with one of EDA's investment priorities, which is included on their website. And one key theme that besides equity that was woven throughout these NOFOs and associated materials is the commitment to resiliency. Besides equity, resiliency is another key theme that's highly focused in on in these programs. Next slide. So who can apply? Well, the district organization, MIPA, when set up, could apply. But beyond that, your state, county, city, other political subdivisions of the state are all eligible. Institutions of higher learning and public or private nonprofit organizations. So 506 organizations typically can apply with some restrictions, but they all must be acting in association in a cooperation with the officials of, and this should say a local entity, so a state, county, or other political subdivision. Next slide. Just to note, and this is going to be questions of what's ineligible. They actually do include that in the NOFOs. So projects that are primarily residential nature, projects to create community amenities like swimming pools and zoos aren't eligible. Things that talk about support for casinos or gaming, projects support general government, none of those are eligible activity types, and just wanted to note that here. Next slide. So the application process. So we've talked to EDA staff about that, and something that we thought would be helpful for everyone is that we're going to send out a worksheet at the conclusion of this presentation. And the whole point of that is for communities and entities to enter potential projects onto those worksheets. Submit those back to the MPO, me specifically, by August 13th, if you can. What we'll do is we'll take all the potential projects in our region, compile them on a list, and what we will do is sit down with EDA staff and review those submitted projects. And they will go through and indicate fundability for which projects they think have the most likelihood of success in the future. That way, you all are not preparing applications for projects that most likely will not receive funding, and EDA staff is more than happy to step in and fill that role. So what we would do is notify all the project sponsors, all the communities that submitted projects, and what EDA indicated for their project. We've put on here fundable projects will continue down the application process, but we really want to note that it has nothing to do with our decision. The applications will be between applicants and EDA. We're just trying to facilitate that process the best way we can. So there's nothing to say that if EDA staff says that project most likely won't get funded and a community wants to still go after that funding, they still most certainly can. And we will be there to help as much as we can. We just were trying to bridge that gap and facilitate projects as best as we can.
Yeah, it's worth noting here that EDA is kind of a curious animal in how they review grant applications. the EDA actually has staff at the regional level whose job it is to understand the project applications and then pitch it to an investment committee. And so that there's going to be EDA staff arguing or advocating for our local projects. And so these are the staff members that we've cultivated a relationship over the last several months. They've been fantastic to work with. And so when we say we can review this with the staff at the EDA, it's the staff members who know what projects are, they know the investment committee, they know what's going to resonate, what's not. And so we'll be able to kind of get a preview of what will or will not likely resonate with the investment committee at the Denver region. So just to give you an understanding of what the EDA's process is like and why it's worth going through the step of a preliminary review with the EDA staff.
Exactly. So if you have a project that you think is middle of the road or you're not sure, please put it down, because we are not the ones who judge that in any way. That's just, we're trying to get that project to EDA so they can give their feedback on your project. And they have indicated as well that if you have a project that may not fit in like this specific program or another program, they will push it to potentially another program that they might know of or make available. So it is a very, they're being very helpful in this process. So please feel free to take a few minutes, put down the project ideas you have, any information you have that's available with that, and we'll forward it on and let you know what we find out. Next slide. Oh, questions. Okay. So I've talked a lot about this. I've tried to condense the information as much as possible. Some of those NOPOs and webinars can be less than helpful. So I tried to pick out the key themes and things that I think all of you would be best made aware of. So this is now the time, I guess, to ask any pertinent questions that you might have. Yeah, we're gonna put in the chat. Feel free to unmute, put questions in the chat, however you'd like to best ask.
Andrew, Rachel Gokin.
Yep.
The list of projects that we would be compiling in the worksheet, is that, and you might have already said this, and I'm so sorry, is that to cover multiple of the 6 programs, or is it specific to one of the programs?
No, you can indicate on there which funding program you think might apply to. EDA staff would also indicate if there's a better program it should go to. We're trying to collect everything as best as we can. That way we can take the limited EDA staff time that they have and condense it so that we don't have 1,000 different questions from the same area.
Sure.
And I'd like to note too that, if there's still funding available after the end of the year, we'll feel free to, send project ideas our way and we'll help facilitate that process. We just didn't mention it right now, that we'll continue to work with projects as long as there's funding still available.
Thank you.
Thanks.
What would qualify in the brownfield? And what I mean by that is it acquisition of the property? Is it demolition, cleaning up? What all for the economic adjustment assistance one?
Right. So yeah, no, that's a good question. So this follows very typically with their traditional funding streams. And by that, I mean, those funds can only go to entities. It can't go to individuals or for-profit companies. I just want to note that. I know that's not your question, but I forgot to mention that. So yes, all of those things I think could potentially be eligible. The key hook on that is if you have to have a direct jobs benefit related to that. So if you have a company or a couple of companies or whatever that say, if you clear the site and get it hooked up to sewer, water, electrical, whatever, and we're going to hire 50, 100 to 150, I'm just throwing out numbers here, jobs, that would make a very strong competitive application. EDA typically looks, when they look at their program funding, for the direct nexus between jobs. So it can't just be like a project where we want to buy this, use the EDA money and sit on it because we don't know what we're going to do with it. That probably won't be fundable because they're looking for creating jobs with their money directly.
So the more jobs, the better shot you have of getting it.
Yes, I caveat that with though they gave examples of it's not necessarily there's no exact number, like there's no jobs, you know, per job number out there. It's a fairly holistic process. One project that was only creating 100 jobs, we get the same amount of money as a project creating 1,000 jobs. It just kind of depends on the project. And I know that's not a great answer because there are a lot of funding programs out there that have a job to benefit ratio. This does not.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Andrew, will you briefly describe what people can expect in the worksheet that we'll be sending people in terms of what kind of questions it's asking for?
Sure. Yeah. So it's a fairly basic and broad sheet because each project, you know, there's a lot of projects out there. We don't want to shoehorn or pigeonhole anybody in particular. So basically, just funding category for the project, name of your project if you have one, just the description of it. There is a question on there about creation of jobs or retention of jobs. Those, again, that's what EDA focuses on, is what are you doing job related directly with our funding, because they want to be a funding partner and they want to fund things that are ready to go. And the last thing that I think that's on there too is just the potential investments made. So even though jobs is their main focus, looking at the investments made by a corporation does help, I think, in the application, just showing, you know, how much investment's being done and what that looks like in the community. Curtis, I see your question here. I'll read it out. If we guess the funding category incorrectly, will you work with EDA staff to align with the best program? Absolutely. Yeah, and EDA staff, they've indicated too at the national level on these webinars that if you put it in a category and they feel it's better in another category, they've reserved the right to do that. But we will most certainly work with our regional office staff to make sure that programs are submitted to the right, or projects submitted to the right programs. Sure thing. I must have answered all your questions up front.
Anything else? We could start calling on people, but I'm not sure if that would be a good use of time.
Yeah, and if anyone has questions, you know, you feel free to email me too, since I'm going to be the contact point for this. Again, you know, if you have a project that's on the fence, just include it. EDA staff will be the ones that indicate any of this. We are just here to facilitate and help funding come into the region. So that's what our goal is, and that's what we shall do. And if you have any questions, I guess, feel free to reach out with anything.
Just want to reiterate our thanks for everyone for being here. And as always, please feel free to reach out.
Yeah, and I guess before we end this, just as a note, when we send out everything, feel free to forward it on too, you know, to people you think might be interested. We're not trying to keep this to one group of people. We're just trying to disseminate it in an orderly fashion, but to the making sure it gets to the right people. So please feel free to forward on as needed. Thank you. Thanks, Gunnar. Thanks, everybody. Thanks, Todd.